Many people think they can afford a single family home, but the concept of a commercial building is beyond their reach because banks won't lend them the money and they just can't afford it. Let me show you how you can do this and exactly what you need to buy a commercial building. A lot of you are looking at getting into real estate. You might have $30,000 or $40,000 to invest. And the question is that enough to get into real estate? Today, we're going to explore exactly how much money you need to get into commercial real estate. To start off with, let's just remind ourselves what is commercial and what is residential. So residential property, I think we all agree, is places where people have residences. But for some reason that I can't understand, multifamily, so a large apartment complex, for instance, in this country, for mortgaging purposes and for appraisal purposes, is considered commercial. Well, I want to point out that if we're saying residential property is where people live, then an apartment complex or multifamily is still residential. And for the sake of our argument, commercial property is where people conduct commerce. It could be shops, it could be offices, it could be industrial, it could be warehouse, it could be storage facilities. Residential is where people live, and commercial is where commerce is conducted. When it comes to commercial property, the value of a commercial property is the rental income divided by the cap rate. Now you might say, I've heard of cap rate, what is it? Cap rate is short for capitalization rate. It literally means the rate at which you capitalize the rental income to arrive at the property value. So let's put some simple numbers to it. Let's say you've got a rental income of $100,000 and the cap rate is 10%. You divide $100,000 by 10% and you get $1 million. If there's $100,000 of rental income when cap rates are 10%, the value of that property is $1 million. That means that if we can double the rental income from $100,000 to $200,000, the cap rate stays the same, it's still 10%. That means the value of that building will have gone from $1 million to $2 million. This is something that you don't get in the residential world. A residential property is worth whatever a comparable property is worth, whether it's tenanted or vacant. But when it comes to commercial real estate, the value of a commercial property is a multiple of its rental income. That is why the tenant is everything when it comes to commercial real estate. Just as it's possible to increase the value of a property, it's easy to find low-cost deals with huge potential upsides. What do we mean by that? We mean find a vacant building or one that's only semi-tenanted. You will buy it at a cheap price because the rent is low and therefore the value is low. But if we can figure out a way of getting a bigger or better tenant or a tenant where there was none before, then suddenly the value of the building goes through the roof. So once I came across a vacant funeral parlor. Now I think you all know what goes on inside a funeral parlor. It's not very good to think of it. They stick stainless steel tubes inside bodies and pull out the blood and replace it with formaldehyde and things like that. So it had been on the market for 3 years. It was vacant. The price kept on coming down. I could buy it for a song, but I didn't because the last thing I want is a vacant building. However, I employed someone to phone every funeral director out there, going further and further away from the center until she found someone who said, oh yes, I've always wanted to operate there. So I said, well, check out the building. If you're willing to sign a letter of intent or a heads of agreement where subject to me buying the property, you will become the tenant, then I'm willing to have a crack at buying the building. Well, he looked at it and said, I love it. I said, well, sign this heads of agreement and I'll have a go at buying the building. And he said, not so fast, Sonny Jim. I'll only do it if you give me a long-term lease. And here's a very interesting little lesson. I would have been willing to give him a 5-year lease. I would have accepted that. But instead of suggesting that, I said, just how long would you like? And he said, I don't want to do it unless you give me 10 years with a right of renewal for another 10 years. In other words, he wanted to sign up on a 20-year lease. This is bliss. This is great. By him signing up, suddenly the building was worth a lot more to me than it was to the seller. With a commitment from the tenant to be my tenant, suddenly the building was worth not only more to me, but it was worth more in the eyes of the bank too. And they gave me a 66% mortgage, but on the new value. And that 66% of the new value covered all but $10,000 of my purchase price. In other words, the cash I had to put into this building was only $10,000. You can't do that with residential property. It works with commercial though. That's how I've made most of my money, buying properties that are under-tenanted or vacant, but before I buy them, I figure out a way of getting a tenant. Getting the tenant is the secret to success in commercial real estate. So how much money do you need? Well, typically banks may lend 50 or 60% of the value of a commercial building. So if you're buying a $1 million building, you might argue, surely you need $500,000 as a down payment. And in general, you'd be right. But remember, we're always looking at ways of beating the average. And one way of beating the average is to find a piece of real estate that is under-tenanted or vacant. And before you buy it, you try and source that tenant. And if you can get the tenant, the value goes up. The bank gives you 50% of that, and that's enough or nearly enough to buy it. I've gotten away with $10,000. I've bought commercial properties with less than $10,000. I've bought commercial properties where after doing the deal, I've managed to put money into my bank account and own the property. It's one of those things where you're limited only by your imagination. And here's the thing, if you don't believe that's possible, you probably won't find deals like this, and your theory that it's not possible will be validated in your mind at least. But if you think, you know what, this might just be possible, let me go out and check it, you will find deals like this. And some you won't find a tenant for, you move on to the next one. But eventually you'll find a deal that's under-tenanted or vacant, you'll find a tenant for it, you'll get a new appraiser, you'll go to the bank, and they'll give you the purchase price. That's what I call a sweet deal. Getting a tenant is just one way of massively increasing the value of a commercial property. There are many others, and in my book, 101 Ways to Massively Increase the Value of Your Real Estate Without Spending Much Money, I devote an entire chapter to ideas of what you can do to a commercial property so that the value goes up by way more than the cost of making those improvements. You can get your free copy of this book by clicking the link below, and you will go through this book and you will find dozens of ideas that you can implement today to massively increase the value, either of property that you own or property that you're looking at buying. I've been in this real estate game for over 40 years, and I post the best content on my channels every week. Hit that subscribe button and watch my next video if you want to find out how to become financially free through investing in real estate.